My name is Lisa Morris and I'm the Early Years Team Manager. Thank you for joining me and watching the Early Years Team Early Years Inclusion Fund webinar. So I'm going to take you through how to apply for Early Years Inclusion Fund and some of the frequently asked questions. So you can see that I am sharing the Early Years and Childcare Early Education Funding webpage, and if you scroll down to the bottom of that page, you'll see information about a range of additional funding. I'm going to mainly focus on Early Years Inclusion Fund. So that you can see we have a cut-off date for the different panels each half term, and then we have the date of the Early Years Inclusion Fund panel, and obviously I'm sharing 24-25, but you may have to go on to look at current dates. And there's a range of documents that you might find useful. So for Early Years Inclusion Fund, we're mainly talking about children that are early education funding, depending on their eligibility. And we have an application form for specialist equipment, and we also have application forms that you can use for level 1 funding or level 2 funding. For under 2s or transition funding, there isn't an application form for settings to use. That's a different process. And this page and the documents, such as the eligibility criteria, will take you through all of the information that you need in terms of eligibility, how to apply, where to send the application. And I would also suggest that you might want to have a look at the flow chart, which we'll look at in a moment. If you want some further information about SEND in general, then you might want to have a look at our Soul Grid web page. For example, we've got a graduated approach, and that will talk to you about the levels of inclusion fund on there as well, and also some guidance around assessment should you need it. So let's go back to talk about the Early Years Inclusion Fund in a little bit more detail. You may also want to have a look at the Disability Access Fund, and that's a one-off payment for children in receipt of disability living allowance, as additional funding for your setting. So you can apply for level 1 or level 2 funding via the application form, which you can see there. Opening that, we have greatly reduced the application form over time, which means that the information that you send for the Assess Plan Do review in the form of your 1 or 2 reviewed plans are absolutely crucial for all of the information that we've taken out of this current iteration of the form. Please don't download and save the form, because we are always, as part of our panel process, updating it. So if you go to the web page and click on the application form, you've always got the most up-to-date. So the application process basically is for mainly early education funded. It's not for reception aged children. We ask you to indicate the funding that the children are receiving, and we also ask you to tell us about their level of attendance. You must not apply for 30 hours worth of inclusion fund, for example, if a child is only attending for 10 hours. We appreciate that sometimes children build up to their full entitlement, but you need to be very cautious about applying for funding that isn't actually relevant for the child's attendance. So your setting name, or obviously if you're a childminder, your childminder's date, the date of application, the name of the child and the child's date of birth, and also your name in terms of SENCO, unless that is you as a childminder as well. We aren't able to pay for non-funded children, so parent paid for children, through Early Years Inclusion Fund, but we are able to source additional funding should you have a child where the parents are paying for time at your setting from an alternative source. You will need, if it's level 2 funding, agreement there from an early years area SENCO or an inclusion support practitioner or a SIS SEND practitioner. We can't agree exceptions without it being agreed by somebody externally to the setting who knows the child. If you've got a child and you're applying for an EHCP and you feel that you haven't got enough time to submit an application for the Early Years Inclusion Fund as well as for an EHC assessment, then those children who come through with an agreement for Solihull EHC assessments, we can automatically fund those children because the EHC panel have agreed that the child's level of need demonstrates emerging special educational needs. Obviously, if a child then becomes early education, health and care panel issue, then the money and the funding will come from the HCP team, not for Inclusion Fund, because Inclusion Fund is for emerging special educational needs. You need to have parental consent. We no longer ask you to put that in the application, but we do ask you to tell us that you have got agreement from parents to apply and presumably have some discussion about how that funding is best used. So we do need to know that you've got consent. Here we've got levels of funding. What I would suggest that you do, and I'll perhaps show you that at the end, is use the flow chart to help you work your way through all of the different levels of funding and the age eligibility of the child. We have an internal process for Early Years Inclusion Fund from area SENCOs or inclusion support practitioners. So we do need to know who that person is, but we have a system whereby I can look up to see whether one of the area SENCOs has agreed that the child is that level of funding. So they're not agreeing funding because that comes through the panel process. They are agreeing that the child is of a level 2 level of need. We don't need that for inclusion funding at level 1. If it's a SIS worker involved, then we will need that signed or at least confirmation via email from that SIS worker for the higher levels of need there. So we need to know what the main need is, and this is where we would be using your assess, plan, do and review process. So your reviews, your plans, your targeted support. We need to know what the needs of the child is as part of your plan. We need to know what you're doing to adapt your provision to show the impact of planning for a graduated approach. And we also need to know how successful that graduated approach is being. So what you're adapting, how you're changing targets, how you're perhaps breaking down into smaller steps, or how you're celebrating that success to show that the things that you're doing are actually having an impact. And that needs to show beyond ordinary available provision and basic differentiation that would be available for all children to show that the level of need is high. Now, one of the main reasons for not agreeing to inclusion funds is that 1 reviewed plan or 2 reviewed plans are not included as part of your submission, and the reviews need to be clear and the dates of those reviews. So sometimes people say, well, it's really clear, it was in red for autumn half term, and then the second half term was in green, but it's been scanned in and it's black and white, so we're not able to see the difference. If you can imagine that the panel, who's myself, Family Information Service, and members of schools or settings, I've got quite a lot of applications to have a look through, so it needs to be quite obvious what the review is and how the reviews then lead to an adaptation. for future plans, and it's good practice to also show the child's voice and also the parents' voice as part of that review and provision plan. We have a space there. If your reviews are very basic, so we wouldn't accept just a tick as part of a review, or a cross, or a yes or a no. We need some detail. So if you haven't got the detail as it outlines here, then you'll need to add that into your application form. Obviously, if all those things are part of your assess, plan, do review process and the documentation you send in, then we won't need additional information. What we will need is, how is that money going to be spent? We're giving you government funding. It needs to be a logic to what that funding is used for. It could be accessing training or cover for training. Please don't put for a one-to-one support. Very few children need full-time one-to-one support. If you feel that a one-to-one support is needed for part of that time and you're asking for that additional resource from inclusion funds, then you need to let us know how that person is going to be deployed. What are they going to be doing? How are they going to be supporting the child? And obviously there's some suggestions there. And we, at the moment, are able to access for free Dingley's Promise training. We suggest that you might want to consider using some of that funding for release time for key people to access the Dingley's Promise training modules, or attend external training, if that makes sense. So I keep reiterating when one or two reviewed plans are needed, just because that's a common mistake. We'd like to know who's involved. If you're saying a child, you're applying because they have speech and language needs, then logic tells us that you should be using a referral to speech and language to access specialist support and advice for that child. We don't need you to send lots of reports because the needs of the child should be outlined in your planning and your delivery plan, really, as well as using that advice and reflecting on that advice within the plan. You can send it if you want to, but we also find that the more documents people send, the more likely it is that they make a mistake on the key information that we need. So what we absolutely need is this application form and either one review plan for level 1 or 2 review plans for level 2. If you want to include other things as well, then please do make sure that those essentials are included there. So again, reiterated it here. So I mentioned a flow chart, and again, this just summarises really what is in the main documents. So it'll take you through step by step each one of the funding elements that you're able to apply for. We quite often get people applying for level 1 where a child's only 2 years old, for example. So you may want to, either yourself or for somebody else, before you send off an application, go through this final check of the flow chart, and it also has a little bit more of a breakdown there. So, in terms of inclusion fund, starting back at the beginning, SolGrid, early years and childcare, early education funding. It's one of the most used web pages that we've got. Go to the early years inclusion fund. That's where we'd like you to send the applications. Ideally, we'd like a pack of information typed in. If you apply for level 1 funding and then you the following panel dates apply for level 2, you've obviously just got to update your application form. It's much more problematic to send to the panel if you take photographs of every individual page, particularly if those pages aren't numbered. So if that can be a condensed application with all of the information either scanned in or copied onto the email to the earlier send funding application box, then that's absolutely brilliant. That makes life much easier. So you might want to be part of the panel. They happen in the afternoon by the cut-off date, and no information is can be submitted after 5 o'clock on these dates. So if you've got to add something onto your email and you send it after 5 o'clock the next day, a week later, then we won't be able to use that as evidence, which may result in that application being rejected. So I collect all of that information with the early years team of administrators, and then we'll send it out a week or 2 weeks, depending on how quickly and how many applications we get, ahead of time to the panel. So if you'd like to sit on 1 panel, 2 panels, please just drop me an email, almorris@solihull.gov.uk, and tell me, you know, I'd like to be on any of them, doesn't matter which one, or I'd like to join the 3rd of April in the afternoon, a 1:30 start, and be part of the panel. We'll then give you access to some confidential information, which obviously you can't share, which will be available to you just before the panel, and then we'll remove that access just after the panel. You have a read through. You'll make sure that you're aware of the terms of reference for that meeting, and I always print off or have available a copy of the flowchart, because when I'm reading the applications, I'm checking the eligibility of the child, I'm checking whether the right signatures are being received, the right consent has been given. And then we all meet on the panel date with our views of whether that child should get the equipment funding or level 1 or level 2, whatever it might be. And you'll receive an update of the current position around inclusion funds, as well as we're all in it together here. We're all sort of having a chat really about what did we find. Was it evidence that there were 2 reviewed plans, for example? Is the child the right age? And then we'll make decisions around the funding. If you're interested in how the funding has been used in the previous year, then you can see that we've got 1 report there, which is soon to be updated, but the reports have to go to the school forum before they're publicly viewed. But actually, the sorts of things that people use the funding for are very common. So you might want to have a look and see how the funding has been used in the past. And it's lovely to read the feedback from parents and from settings themselves about the impact that Early Years Inclusion Fund has had, and what that's enabled a child to be able to access. So that's the funding report. You don't need to reapply for funding every term or each year. If a child moves from one Solihull setting to another Solihull setting, as long as it's not reception, then the funding travels with them. And obviously what we'd ask you to do, if you feel that that funding is no longer needed, then to ask for that funding to be removed as well, because that means that somebody else can get the use out of that funding. So have a look at the Sole Grid page on the early education funding, find out a little bit more. I'd suggest, if you don't know anything about Disability Access Fund, that is the other thing to have a look at as well, because that's another form of funding that can come in to help support you, to support children in your care. So that's it for me. Please ask us if there are any questions that you'd like answered and added to our frequently asked questions, and also when we update these videos as key things changes. Thanks very much.